my name's Mike Perlman. I teach at CSI, Combat Studies Institute, Command Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. Jeff Shadburn, Jerry Brown, and I are going to discuss some of the issues here to Lesson 11, the Pacific War. Hopefully you'll get some ideas that you can run with and probably do a better job than any of us ever do when we try to teach this course here, which really wouldn't be a high standard at all. Anyway, I'm going to throw out some questions here to my alleged subject matter experts. We've got here, for instance, you've got these three learning objectives. Analyze the major events in the Pacific War from 1943 to 1945. Let me, number one, say I think this is a misprint. The Pacific War for the United States, of course, goes from 1941, from Pearl Harbor to 45, and we're going to focus here on the war as a whole, just not the latter period, which is the period in which the United States goes on the strategic and operational offense. Anyway, on Pearl Harbor Day, or actually before Pearl Harbor Day, the United States Armed Forces has been in staff talks with the British, so at least we have a strategy to be executed after Pearl Harbor Day. It's obviously a contingent strategy. It's to be executed if the United States becomes a belligerent. And essentially, well, subject matter experts, what is the strategy for the Pacific theater in what is a global war?
The first thing is to make sure you focus on the primary threat to the United States, which is perceived as Germany, which means against the Japanese Empire. You're going to have a strategic defensive action to ensure that you don't siphon off strength that you're going to use against Germany.
Now, what is the what's considered the worry in December 1941 if the United States goes on a two-ocean or two-continent offensive war in both directions at the same time? Worst case, what's the response?
I'm not sure what you're getting after that, but the worst case scenario is Britain's been knocked out of the war and it's the United States alone.
Only Britain? Well, we've got another ally.
That's right, France as well.
France has been knocked out, and now the Soviet Union.
And the Soviet Union
has not done very well in the first 6 months of their war.
In fact, when he's talking about the Soviet Union may not have entered the war at all, so it's a undivided Germany that's conquered Great Britain, France.
This is December 1941. The Soviets are on the doors of Moscow. They're on the doors of Leningrad. They've captured Kiev. They're moving in towards, well, not yet towards Stalingrad. They are hanging on by their fingernails. The worry is that if the United States does not reinforce Europe quickly, if it beats Japan, it will then have to turn around and beat Germany with who as allies?
The United States as allies?
Yeah, well, who will be? Do you want to take on the Germans one-on-one?
Absolutely. The United States, worst case, absolutely no allies.
So, your perfectly sensible solution is what?
Is hang on to the continental United States while you build up your combat power to project it into Europe.
And what does this mean for operations in the Pacific if for unforeseen circumstances we go to war with Japan? Wouldn't it be, by the way, better if we, say, did something which would deter Japan? I got a brilliant idea. I mean, I'm so smart I can't stand myself, just like you can't stand myself. Let's move the fleet from San Diego to Pearl Harbor on the grounds of that this will deter the Japanese from moving at all. And therefore, we won't have a war because we'll put them in a box.
Well,
isn't that great?
In fact, as long as we do that, why don't we put some long-range bombers into the Philippines that can reach all the way to Japan?
Oh, you mean those B-17s?
Of course, they can't reach Japan.
Well,
but that's
true.
okay.
They can reach into China.
Oh, they can reach Formosa,
They
but
cut off
all this will do. Oh, you guys are as smart as I am, which says something for you.
Or
In
not.
other words, we won't have to use this stuff. We'll just make sure that they'll be so intimidated that they won't be a threat to American or British vital interests in the Philippines, Singapore, or what's then called the Dutch New Netherlands, which will become Indonesia after the war. Okay, we've agreed? And they won't move?
No, absolutely not. Japanese won't. They'll be intimidated and they won't do anything.
Okay, so then we only really have to worry about this war in Europe. That's a great idea.
How do you justify that in light of the fact that for the previous 30 years, Plan Orange had been our primary strategic focus?
What's this Plan Orange? I haven't heard of anything yet. Well, would you explain what this Plan Orange is?
was one of the color plans that had been initiated back under the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt.
As a law? Not Franklin.
No, I said Theodore.
Okay.
As a contingent for the defense of our interest in the Far East.
Which is particularly
the Philippines.
So it's a hostage rescue plan if the Japanese take the
And
Philippines.
this plan had been worked on for more than 30 years. It had been revised and war-gamed and studied, and everybody considered this to be the most likely scenario until the late 1930s.
Well, likely scenario.
War, in which the United States might become involved.
Well, actually, the most likely war we're going to have by most Americans is against Mexico. But if we go to war in the Pacific and the Philippines seem to be some sort of hostage, it's virtually it is adjacent to Japanese home waters. They can take it. We have to have a plan to take it back. But, by the way, if we put these B-17s in the Philippines, in Luzon, Clark Air Force Base, and we move the fleet into Pearl Harbor, I guarantee you the Japanese will be too intimidated, so we don't have to rescue the Philippines. They'll simply quake in their boots. Of course, if I'm wrong, we got some B-17s that will be shot, will be destroyed, not even getting off the ground, and we're going to have some battleships like the Arizona. Lots of good men are going to be dead.
The next thing to look at it to make that work is you have to be able to protect what you extend out there to intimidate the Japanese. And what MacArthur, he predicts that he'll be ready to defend Luzon effectively against the Japanese by the summer of 1942. But before then, the Filipino army won't be ready.
So does this mean the Japanese look upon, obviously, a deterrent to us may look like a threat to them, and they have a window of opportunity to close this threat? Because if they wait, the Philippines will be stronger to defend. The other thing is that in 1940, America passes its first great naval building budget, the third Carl Vinson bill, since, I don't know, since the days of Theodore Roosevelt.
Right. So
this fleet will come in with 12 new aircraft carriers, not these Jeep carriers, you know, the big enchiladas. I think it's 17 new battleships in 1943. Meaning if Japan is going to move, they've got 2 to 3 years to move. And what looks like a deterrent, which is to stop them from moving, becomes a target to be hit. And in December 1941 through the first years of the war, say through March or April 1942, what does Japan specifically, or just in big pictures, do?
They try and extend the control of the Pacific as far as they can get it to create a large buffer, so that as they go into war with the United States, if they can create that buffer, they can make it more difficult for the United States to reach all the way to Japan, and then they can take more control of the situation. They have time to do that.
The Japanese Empire, as of December 1941, it is Formosa. They have they've just established control of Cam Bay, projecting out into the, and I was confused east and west in this world. East into the Pacific, the Japanese Empire is how extensive in December 1941?
Well, it's not very far at that point, because there are several obstacles that sit athwart their locks, one of which is the Philippines. And so before they can extend their area of influence in the area in which they can exploit the resources of the Pacific, they have to take out the Philippines.
But
critical for them.
But the Philippines is not sky blue. It is an obstacle on the way for what is. So we're talking about a 4 or 5 month period in which, in terms of physical distance, the Japanese have the greatest conquest
between December and April.
In the history of mankind. 5 month period, they are extending all the way to places nobody, and very few people have ever heard of in the West. Some god-awful place, Guadalcanal, or to the eastern tip of New Guinea, a place called Buna, in which does what to the U.S. strategy, which going into Pearl Harbor is to hold defensive perimeter from Alaska to Hawaii to the Panama Canal, beat Germany. And if Japan remains, which I say, stubborn and doesn't listen to reason, after Germany is beaten, then the U.S. goes on the offensive. The only problem with the strategy, like most problems with strategy, is the opponent doesn't read the script. He doesn't know that he is supposed to, in effect, be satisfied on the other side, on his side of the wire, defensive perimeter. And Japan is now threatening to close off America's contacts with, specifically,
with Australia.
As Australia is going to be for the United States, something like Britain will be for the European theater. It is the major base from which America will project its combat power and the strategy, which means that now the United States, by 1942, will be making commitments by, I guess it's mid-1942, commitments which it never foresaw in the original concept of strategy in the Pacific.
And conversely, the Japanese have expanded far beyond their initial expectations.
Because I guess they were putting the pedal to the metal and say, I'll go as far as my logistics tail can take me, and there's not much physical. The resistance out there is natural. It is nature, it is the water, it is your own ability to simply get there. And they're extending far beyond their initial concept, because as you said, Jeff, they have this idea that the further and further we extend, the more and more difficult it will be for the U.S. to push us back to our inner core empire, which we must maintain under all circumstances. In other words, I get in strategic depth, and that's always a good idea.
Well, not really. I think the Japanese will find that out. One of the problems they have in trying to establish that buffer is, it's the other side of that, the second learning objective we have, even though we're going to look at the U.S. as far as divided command, but for the Japanese, the Pacific is a Navy theater, at which once the Navy seizes the outer perimeter for the empire, it's going to be defended by the Army. But the Army's main effort is in China. And while they're prepared to...
It will always be in China.
It will always be in China. While they're prepared to defend what's agreed upon in the Pacific, when the Navy extends control past those agreed areas, it will cause the Army forces not to be increased in the area, so they will become less strong and further out and won't be preparing defenses where they had originally agreed on the outer perimeter.
But they will be, because they will be in areas in which they are new to that area.
Yes.
New Guinea, the Solomons. They don't have time to prepare, and certainly the combat environment is horrendous for everybody.
They spend so much time pushing out that they continue to push until the United States is ready to do something about it, and so they have less time to prepare. Whereas if they would have had a less strategic depth, they would have had more time to prepare what they had seized instead of less time to defend even more.
Well, in this case, as horrendous as these two America ground forces' first two battles, Guadalcanal for the Marine Corps with an Army division, Buna with MacArthur, and most of the casualties, Americans, are one of disease, exacerbated by malnutrition. As bad as it is for us, it's even worse for the Japanese, because they are extended really beyond their reach. The Navy can relatively isolate this area. If the Japanese were well fed and sustained, I think they'd be holding Buna today. Most of their casualties are malaria and disease. And we have a hell of a time getting combat power there. And it is relatively weak, but they are a shell when we get into contact with them. Somebody says it reminds historians, like Burma in the rainy season. You in effect have got these two, I don't know, a lion and a tiger, but they're chained down. And they only get the extent of a little paw out there, because their problem is even getting out there at all.
But you only move a company down a trail. That's all you can come in. You may have a whole division attacking, but only a company can come in contact at a time.
Which is MacArthur's problem at Buna. The thing that saves him is that the Japanese are so strapped to basic food and medicine that they are almost withering on the vine out there to begin with. All right, so we've got this in 41, 42. And beginning in mid-42, the United States does make greater commitments than it had ever conceived, but originally now, commitment is justified as protecting the lines of communication to Japan, to Australia. In other words, I'm still considering this within the strategic defensive that I will have in the Pacific until we beat Germany. But like many things in war, you get a ladder up. Now you have beaten the Japanese at Buna. You have beaten the Japanese at Guadalcanal and then at Bougainville, which is also in this area here of lines of communication to Australia. Now the question is, what do we do next?
Well, you got two choices. One is, once you've solidified and held that line of communication,
wasn't that my purpose?
Yes, I says your one choice is at that point in time fall back on the defensive and shift your resources back to Europe. Your other choice is to change your mind and say, look, right now we've got them backpedaling. We've got to keep them. We got to keep pushing to keep them from getting set.
Because they're not going to consolidate.
They consolidate, they dig in, they fortify, and boy, that's going to be a tough nut to crack when you go after them in 1945 or 46
or 47
or 47.
But there's also another condition that makes that possible, and that is that mobilization is being more successful than anticipated. More equipment is coming off the production line than you had anticipated. So now you have more resources to do more with.
Now there's another issue on this, because this is a theater of a global war.
Yes.
And that is the United States has still not putting ground forces of any great strength into Europe, because we still have a Mediterranean strategy. And how many divisions can you put into Sicily? Meaning that now, because in effect the cross-channel invasion is now being put on hold, while America and the British are debating this whole strategy and this issue. And the other thing is that the Russians have survived 41. They have survived at Stalingrad for the winter of 42-43. They are holding their own. It would mean with all these issues, I think we're going to change the nature of this European first strategy.
So you're saying Germany all of a sudden becomes less of a threat?
No, well, not less of a threat. I think Germany remains a great threat.
But less than they were before.
But
we thought
it doesn't.
Germany threatening
yes, we're
our
not
national
talking
existence.
about Germany beating the Russians after Stalingrad. We may be talking about the Russians exhausting, and the Germans and the Russians, which is a big fear in the United States, about coming to some sort of understanding. Maybe going back to the borders of 1939 or 41. It's a possibility, but we're not considering, as we did in December 41, are the Russians about to be closed off within a 3 to 4 month period? Germany may remain still the major threat, but it looks like the Russians can hold their end of the bargain. We have yet to find, to get into Northwest Europe, a lodgement area in which we can commit these masses of forces. And here is all these issues to say we're going to change the nature of Europe first, or Germany first. And it changes with the U.S., where it once was hold in the Pacific, win in Europe, and then go on the offensive in the Pacific. There'd probably be a 2-year, some people say 3-year, difference between VE Day and VJ Day. The idea is to go on a 2-ocean war, and the difference in Europe first is, we'll just have a surrender of Germany first, and our people, particularly Marshall's very good at this one, is that we're going to be in trouble politically at home once we defeat Germany. There'll be a lot of people saying it's Miller time. As they do, is that we better have a close window. We better make this a bang-bang finish. 3 to 6 months maximum, or else what's going to happen is, remember, we've got some disadvantages or advantages, is that certainly the Russians and the Germans don't have. They don't put war strategy, grand strategy, up to a political vote. In fact, neither do the British. They will not hold an elections during a war. They say we're going to depoliticize this. The United States is the only country that I know of in the world that has elections in the midst of the war, and if the public say, hey, you guys are screwing up, we can, if we can't, we can find a new commander-in-chief. Anyway, so in 43, we changed the nature of this European first strategy, and we say, go on the offensive in the Pacific. But that doesn't tell me much. Go on the offensive with who as Think Pacific, and in what avenue of approach towards the Far East. We have got the Navy out of Pearl Harbor, owning the Central Pacific. We have Douglas MacArthur, commander, Southwest Pacific area, out of his base in Australia into New Guinea, trying to go towards, the Philippines. I guess the Navy's on its way, it hopes, towards Formosa. And, any good arguments for making Douglas MacArthur sink Pacific Theater, which would make Southwest Pacific area the main avenue of approach, and having in effect the Navy being the transport service for the Army, and of course protecting the Army transportation from raids by aircraft carriers, essentially.
As you already stated earlier, the Pacific is essentially a Navy theater.
So that's to be said against?
It's a large body of water. You're not going to do anything out there without the Navy. The Navy will not only transport you to and from where you're going, it will protect your vessels as they go to and from. It will also ultimately, at some point in the future, be responsible for carrying the war to the enemy.
Well, obviously, this world, I mean, it isn't my fault that this world is 2/3 water. I mean, if it was at least me, this would be decaffeinated coffee. But the question is that the function of the Navy to do what essentially the Navy does for the European theater, which is to get the Army ashore and get it supplied. Now, if the Navy loses the Battle of the Atlantic, we cannot get an Army ashore. But look, we got a Europe, he's not a European theater, it's not Europe-wide, SHAEF commander, who's an Army guy, Eisenhower, under the understanding that the Army will be the lead service for beating Germany.
But you have to deal with Douglas MacArthur, who...
Do I have to?
Yes, you can't avoid dealing with Douglas MacArthur.
Well,
you can't talk about this war and not talk about Douglas MacArthur.
By grade, he outranks the Chief of Staff.
He doesn't he doesn't by grade outrank the President of the United States.
No.
But the thing is, in 1940, Douglas MacArthur is perhaps the only soldier whose name is known in every household in America. At that time, people like Dwight Eisenhower are still obscure colonels,
lieutenant colonels,
and people like George Marshall are still not totally known quantities. But Douglas MacArthur is a force.
Oh, well, I understand. Okay.
And you have to deal with this guy. He has name recognition. He is a genuine American hero. He has been a general officer now for 22 years, longer than many of the soldiers will be alive.
Well, here, so far what you have given me, and I'm President of the United States, is political advice about that this guy can raise a crowd against me. He may be even a challenger if he resigns. What Harry Truman used to say when military guys gave him political advice, saying that's my business, not yours.
And Harry Truman at this time is an obscure senator from Missouri.
Thank you. I'll make the point again, which is...
In 1950, you can say that.
Thank you. Is that I don't want political advice from amateurs. I'll go to politicians for political advice. I'm asking you to give me a good military reason why I should not make the Central Pacific the main avenue of approach. What is to be said for SWAPA?
Well, once again, if you would let me...
Do I have to?
Proceed. You can't separate these issues from issues of personality and from issues of history.
In other words, you want to give me these political reasons.
Franklin Roosevelt, but you can't separate them.
I certainly
can. You can't separate the military from the political. There's every reason to argue that the Central Pacific is the shortest route to Tokyo. There's every reason to argue that Plan Orange, which had been worked on for
Navy,
for
not
three
the
decades,
Army.
for 3 decades, in fact, came up with the best possible solution to defeat a Japanese threat in the Pacific.
Well, what would be? I wish we had maps here. What would be the downside of using this extraordinary fleet, particularly these fast aircraft carriers, as fire support for Douglas MacArthur's hopping up the spine of New Guinea back to the Philippines, which I guess we could argue as a base, particularly when we could then reconstitute it as a submarine base to cut off Japanese supplies to the Southwest Pacific area, which is particularly its energy and petroleum supplies.
As it turns out, you don't need the Philippines as a submarine base. Pearl Harbor works very fine.
All the more reason now then for them to argue that General MacArthur should be made some backwater commander, except for the fact that he's got name recognition.
There's another reason, and once again, you will perhaps disagree with it because it is a political, moral obligation, and that is when MacArthur goes on the national media in March of 1942 with his famous I shall return speech. This is a commitment which the United States is going to find it very difficult to turn its a blind eye to. First of all, we have a moral political commitment to the Philippines.
Yes, but you know how you can get the Philippines? You force the Japanese to surrender in Tokyo, and guess what? They don't keep the Philippines.
I don't disagree with that. What I'm saying is that it's not clear in perhaps March and April of 1942, when these deals are being worked out, what's going to happen by 1944, when we have clearly taken the initiative, when our submarine campaign is being very effectively unleashed against Japanese trade in the Western Pacific, when we have landed now in the Philippines, when we have also landed on numerous other islands in the Pacific, and we have begun to figure out how to fight our way back across the Pacific. Nobody can predict in the early months of 1942 how successful the Fast Carrier Task Force is going to be. That is all yet in the future. There are people who make claims, who prophesy, who foresee, but nobody can tell you yet how successful that is going to be. And there are those Americans who have that great sentimental feeling for the Filipinos, who have been painted in American propaganda as suffering grievously under the occupation of the Japanese.
If they do resist, collaborators don't suffer. There's people who resist too.
And I'm not saying they don't. I'm just saying there's a tremendous propaganda effort.
So far,
in the United States.
So far,
I haven't given you a single military reason.
thing that will not pass such things is you've given me lots of political reasons. One, presidents get to office by being political
high-level
people.
strategic decisions are often made for political reasons.
Well, but political means a lot of different things. You're talking essentially domestic political,
okay,
as opposed to international political.
This is a domestic political issue.
Thank you. When I run for county commissioner, I know who to make my campaign chairman, Jeff.
And there's something is going to happen in November of 1942. There's going to be a congressional election, which will perhaps be a mandate on the conduct of the war up to that point. And 1942 has not been a happy year for the United States fortunes around the world.
No question about it. Is one of the things reason why when Franklin Roosevelt gets into Guadalcanal, which is the longest battle in American history. I'm not even sure we should call it a battle. It's a campaign that lasts for approximately 6 months, from August of 42 to January, is that he sure as hell doesn't want a loss to stare him in this face. But now that we have got Guadalcanal, the question, and we made the decision for, I think, justifiable military reasons, that the world has changed since December, that we can go on a two-ocean offense or a two-continent offense at the same time. The question becomes, for the Pacific, what should be the avenue of approach? Now, MacArthur obviously wants to make it his area of operations.
Well, you asked before.
Nimitz wants to make it his area of operations. What would be the downside, since you apparently don't think there is much
Before you get to the downside, you asked for the military reasons why you should focus on MacArthur going up the Philippines.
Yes.
The first one is to interdict the Japanese line of communication into the Southern Resources area.
Okay.
If you focus on the Central Pacific first, trying to get to the main islands in Japan, you are not going to be able to invade the main islands in Japan until you can weaken their military machine, and you can't do that unless you interdict their access into the Southern Resources area.
It's actually done through the submarine campaign, not by taking the Philippines.
Again, that's not predicted that can be effective. And if you take
and there's another thing on this. They would be more effective if we could liberate the Philippines. Even I can understand that when you were projecting all the way from Pearl Harbor, your turnaround time and your petroleum expenditure just to get in this area, you obviously would like a base. Now, it so happens that the submarines are effective prior to the liberation of Luzon, which I guess isn't really until December of 44.
But that's not predicted.
Okay.
Largely as a result of Japanese inability.
If you could retake the Philippines in early 1943 or mid-1943 and effectively interdict those locks from the Dutch East Indies, then that would be a strong military argument for going
the
to the
SWAPA.
Philippines. The problem is, however, that in the early months of 1943, you're still mopping up in New Guinea. You're a long way from being ready to go to the Philippines yet. And you have other places that still have to be dealt with.
It's kind of interesting because when you look at the decisions that are being made, they're based on timetables that are years out, not in a matter of months. They're trying to say, we think in 6 months this is going to be the situation, and they make decisions based on that prediction. And it's kind of interesting to watch that go on. A second military reason, if you're able to retake the Philippines, you remove any threats to Australia that still exist. From the Japanese. Now that's not a major reason because from the Philippines they can only reach, I think, with air power into the northwestern part of Australia.
And there's nothing there.
So
except
you
Port
could argue,
Darwin, which is probably overblown as a
So you can still argue that may be primarily a political reason as opposed to a military reason. And then you also have the possibility of being able to bring in Filipinos into the American Armed Forces, but I don't think that's a major reason either. A third, and probably more important in the decision that could have been important in a decision to focus on the Philippines, is to open up a line of communication into China that doesn't go through Burma, that allows you to base aircraft in China so you can bomb Japan directly from China.
All the more reason now for going to Formosa.
Yes, which means Formosa. So you go through the Philippines to reach Formosa.
Well, or else a direct move from the Central Pacific to Formosa.
Now the problem there, and that kind of gets a problem, you can do that from the Central Pacific, but then the flank of the Central Pacific approach is threatened from the Philippines. So if you go through the Central Pacific to Formosa, you need to again seize the Philippines to protect that left flank.
But Japanese strength in the Philippines ultimately is not its naval and sea power, but approximately 300,000 men that they will eventually move into the Philippines.
Yes.
As we see in such battles as the Leyte Gulf. Japanese naval power.
Of course, that's late in 44.
It's land-air power, and then you're trying to predict well out. But that doesn't mean that you can't have the main effort still be in the Central Pacific, controlled by Nimitz, with MacArthur and the Philippines being a supporting effort.
Okay, since both you guys failed this question, and these poor people here are listening saying, you mean these guys can't even agree on what day it is? And I'm going to have to listen to these guys for help? I will summarize and then hopefully get on to another issue. There's good arguments for both sides. If we had a map here, you could see that particularly these aircraft carriers, and particularly the way they're built by the American Navy, they are built to have maximum amount of planes, natural amount of munitions, which means, as I've said before in a prior one, they're made with teakwood decks rather than they are today with steel decks. This is an extraordinary amount of combat power in, I guess, an area as large as 2 football fields. Nothing equivalent to it in ground warfare, but it is very vulnerable. And in SWAPA area, it is literally running a gauntlet. It would be far, far preferable to use the Central Pacific, which is massive amount of water with little, I'm looking for the words, they're not even islands, what do we call them?
The atolls.
Little atolls here in which an aircraft carrier Well, the job is to hide or disguise its position. If it can be in any point in the circumference, obviously it's safer. If you go against a place like New Guinea, by its very width, you're cutting it, it can only be in half the circumference. I'm immediately cutting off 180 degrees of searching for it. So it is hell for aircraft carriers. But on the other hand, what MacArthur does have, there's no room for maneuver in aircraft carriers or capital ships or cruisers. However, what does MacArthur has as a military argument for SWAPA? And that is, where once infantry gets ashore at places like Tarawa, where can it maneuver?
Straight ahead.
It can't. It's a postage stamp. SWAPA is maneuver space for infantry. MacArthur, and he becomes an expert at this, can in effect land behind enemy lines. There is no landing behind enemy lines on these postage stamps, Kwajalein or Tarawa in the Central Pacific. In other words, that area may be safe for the Navy, but it's hell on the Navy's Army, the Marine Corps. Yeah, but you know, there is a prima ballerina, and in the Navy it is the aircraft carrier, and it is infantry that's sacrificed to the prima ballerina. And in SWAPA, infantry is supreme. This is an Army base, and the Navy will be exposed. So there are good arguments to be said for, or bad arguments to be said for either avenue of approach. And the final American solution, when there are good arguments or bad arguments on either side, is, okay, same arguments for A, same arguments for B, and my final decision will be A or B is what?
A and B.
A and B. Do them both. Don't have a commander-in-chief Pacific area. What's to be said for that type of final decision?
Well, one, everybody gets a piece of the action.
Again, we're back to politics.
Yes.
Military. What's to be said for it for military justification?
It presents some significant problems for the Japanese because there is no main effort for them to put their main effort against for defense. And with their inability to maneuver across the Pacific, once the U.S. Navy takes control of it, it causes them to split their efforts on both avenues, where the United States, and in spite of their adversarial relationship, Nimitz and MacArthur actually cooperate. They're able to shift the main effort back and forth between the two axes so that they're able to bring overwhelming combat power to bear on either axis on an alternating basis.
And they're able to do that because the increasing resources available to those forces allow them that freedom.
Oh.
If you have a resource-constrained situation, then you have to make a decision.
Yes.
Which one of those two forces will get the resources. But as resources expand, and they expand very well in 43, and more so in 44, you have now the freedom of action to choose one or the other or both.
And the correct decision in retrospect was to
do exactly what they did, have dual main axes.
But so this turns out to be a correct military decision, perhaps done for incorrect reasons. In other words, Roosevelt doesn't want to have a revolt in the Army or a revolt of the Navy. He can't make up his mind, so he does what any politician will do in this situation. He will not make a clear decision. He will give approximately the same thing to each of these two petitioning groups, which may be a hell of a way to run a railroad, but it turns out to be the correct decision.
It works.
It gets the cargo there because you have enough engines.
Well, I know it works, but probably
you have enough engines.
The question is not just whether it works, because I think SWAPA would have eventually worked. The Central Pacific worked. My question is this the correct decision, the best decision that could have been made? And maybe it was made because we should have had somebody in the White House who would make a decision, but he didn't. He let, in effect, the situation dictate to him, and it turns out to be what was the the best situation?
Yes.
You have an opinion on this, or is this the one topic in the world you don't have an opinion on?
I'm prepared to say that if you judge it ex post facto, it's the right decision.
Well, that's what we do in our business. We judge everything ex post facto.
It's interesting as you look at it. We're talking about unity of effort between the commands as opposed to principle of unity of command.
Unity of effort is what is done by joint or combined operations by, in effect, separate institutions, because one will not subordinate to another. Wait. I have a protest against this position that this turns out to be the correct decision for military reasons.
I would say it's
in retrospect.
A correct decision.
Well, you said the correct decision.
I said incorrect.
We'll settle this one away from the camera.
Get on. You got to win the war yet.
Well, we may never get to it. What turns out to be the downside? I believe that Central Pacific. We've got these aircraft carriers that once they get sunk, takes 3 years to build. They cannot be replaced. They have to be used in the Central Pacific. If we look upon this strictly as a Pacific theater issue, this dual approach turns out to be not a correct decision. You're wrong, as you usually are. It turns out to be the correct decision. One problem is that this is not a Pacific war. This is a Pacific theater in a world war. MacArthur has got, I guess it's 2 armies, right?
Yes.
He's got under his the 6th and the 8th. This could have been Eisenhower's strategic reserve. It would have given Eisenhower another army group for Europe in 1944. Those poor guys, from September to March, September 1944 to March 1945, are on the line day in and day out because there is no reserve. Eisenhower's strategic reserve, so that he could do the type of punch a hole and exploit that the Russians do, which have a great operational reserves, are with Douglas MacArthur in New Guinea. And that's the downside of a good decision, but there are no decisions that don't have downsides. Okay, I'm trying to give a brief separate wrap-up now so I can get you out from watching this tape and back to your real work. This is on how the war in the United States against Japan ends. For those who want a fuller rendition of at least my thesis, I can't say I recommend, but you may want to read Unconditional Surrender, Demobilization of the Atomic Bomb. It's an essay I wrote. It's published at CSI. It's for free, so at least you'll get your money's worth. All right, what's the situation in 1945? Japan has never conceived of the possibility of the conquest and the occupation of the United States. They have always wanted, by the force of arms, to impose their empire in the Pacific, to make the United States accept it as a fact of life, like, say, the United States had accepted the British Empire as a fact of life. And they planned to do this in 1945 by raising up the cost in blood and treasure of continuing this war. Now, in 1941-42, Japan had extended their empire from its core Northern Asian empire, which is Formosa, Korea, Manchuria, and northern China, into what we talked about earlier, which is everything from French Indochina all the way east to the Solomons, in tropical or southern Asia. Now, they've lost all that by 1945, but they haven't lost their core Northern Asia empire. And in 1945, at Luzon, Okinawa, and Iwo Jima, the United States suffers 50% of the total casualties in 6 months' time that it will suffer in the total war, 3.5 years. At this time, there are lots of signals that Japan's strategy is working, in that war weariness is setting in on the American public. And it becomes particularly acute after VE Day, victory in Europe, because the United States obviously wants to celebrate. What's the indication of this war weariness? Well, demobilization of the U.S. Army. 450,000 soldiers, combat veterans. George Marshall calls them the wheels that make the Army run, are demobilized early. Congress is talking about demobilizing another 1 million men, and we have yet to face what is the worst problem, maybe in this entire war, which is the invasion of the home islands of Japan. Japan plans, they know exactly what beaches we're planning to invade, have virtually called the time, our order of battle, meet that force on the beachhead, knock it back, and then negotiate. Assist a peace treaty in which they will retain control of, obviously, Japan itself. There will be no demilitarization, no war criminals. The Japanese Army will retain control of the Japanese government and their Northern Asian empire. Well, what's the U.S. response to that? We demand unconditional surrender. At the same time, we demand demobilization of our own army. So there's an enormous gap between Japanese demands, U.S. demands, and also a growing gap between U.S. demands and the price in blood and treasure that the U.S. will pay for it. How do you close that gap? Well, in war, you do it with armed conflict. But I think we've about had it in the blood that we are willing to spill of our own blood. And the way how you close that gap in 1945, you guessed it, is the atomic bomb. This way America can have its war aims and demilitarize and change the political structure of Japan without paying the price on the beachheads that Japan would have extracted from us. Okay, gang. My name's Mike Perlman. I teach at CSI, Combat Studies Institute, Command Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. Jeff Shadburn, Jerry Brown, and I are going to discuss some of the issues here to Lesson 11, the Pacific War. Hopefully you'll get some ideas that you can run with and probably do a better job than any of us ever do when we try to teach this course here, which really wouldn't be a high standard at all. Anyway, I'm going to throw out some questions here to my alleged subject matter experts. We've got here, for instance, you've got these 3 learning objectives. Analyze the major events in the Pacific War from 1943 to 1945. Let me, number 1, say I think this is a misprint. The Pacific War for the United States, of course, goes from 1941, from Pearl Harbor to 45, and we're going to focus here on the war as a whole, just not the latter period, which is the period in which the United States goes on the strategic and operational offense. Anyway, on Pearl Harbor Day, or actually before Pearl Harbor Day, the United States Armed Forces has been in staff talks with the, which says something for you. In other words, we won't have to use this stuff. We'll just make sure that they'll be so intimidated that they won't be a threat to American or British vital interests in the Philippines, Singapore, or what's then called the Dutch New Netherlands, which will become Indonesia after the war. Okay, we've agreed? And they won't move?
No, absolutely not. Japanese won't. They'll be intimidated and they won't do anything.
Okay, so then we only really have to worry about this war in Europe. That's a great idea.
How do you justify that in light of the fact that for the previous 30 years, Plan Orange had been our primary strategic focus?
What's this Plan Orange? I haven't heard of anything yet. Well, would you explain what this Plan Orange is?
Was one of the color plans that had been initiated back under the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt.
As a law? Not Franklin.
No, I said Theodore.
Okay.
As a contingent for the defense of our interest in the Far East.
Which is particularly
the Philippines.
So it's a hostage rescue plan if the Japanese take the Philippines.
And this plan had been worked on for more than 30 years. It had been revised and war gamed and studied, and everybody considered this to be the most likely scenario until the late 1930s.
Well, likely scenario
war, in which the United States might become involved.
Well, actually, the most likely war we're going to have by most Americans is against Mexico. But if we go to war in the Pacific and the Philippines seem to be some sort of hostage, it's virtually it is adjacent to Japanese home waters. They can take it. We have to have a plan to take it back. But, by the way, if we put these B-17s in the Philippines, in Luzon, Clark Air Force Base, and we move the fleet into Pearl Harbor, I guarantee you the Japanese will be too intimidated, so we don't have to rescue the Philippines. They'll simply quake in their boots. Of course, if I'm wrong, we got some B-17s that will be shot, will be destroyed, not even getting off the ground, and we're going to have some battleships like the Arizona. Lots of good men are going to be dead.
The next thing to look at it to make that work is you have to be able to protect what you extend out there to intimidate the Japanese. And what MacArthur, he predicts that he'll be ready to defend Luzon effectively against the Japanese by the summer of 1942. But before then, the Filipino army won't be ready.
So does this mean the Japanese look upon, obviously, a deterrent to us may look like a threat to them, and they have a window of opportunity to close this threat? Because if they were not yet towards Stalingrad, they are hanging on by their fingernails. The worry is that if the United States does not reinforce Europe quickly, if it beats Japan, it will then have to turn around and beat Germany with who as allies?
The United States as allies?
Yeah, well, who will be? Do you want to take on the Germans one-on-one?
Absolutely. The United States, worst case, absolutely no allies.
So your perfectly sensible solution is what?
Is hang on to the continental United States while you build up your combat power to project it into Europe.
And what does this mean for operations in the Pacific if for unforeseen circumstances we go to war with Japan? Wouldn't it be, by the way, better if we did something which would deter Japan? I got a brilliant idea. I mean, I'm so smart I can't stand myself, just like you can't stand myself. Let's move the fleet from San Diego to Pearl Harbor on the grounds of that this will deter the Japanese from moving at all. And therefore, we won't have a war because we'll put them in a box.
Well,
isn't that great?
In fact, as long as we do that, why don't we put some long-range bombers into the Philippines that can reach all the way to Japan?
Oh, you mean those B-17s?
Of course, they can't reach Japan.
Well, true. Okay. They can reach into China.
Well, they can reach Formosa. But all this will do. Oh, you guys are as smart as I am. British, so at least we have a strategy to be executed after Pearl Harbor Day. It's obviously a contingent strategy. It's to be executed if the United States becomes a belligerent. And essentially, Well, subject matter experts, what is the strategy for the Pacific theater in what is a global war?
The first thing is to make sure you focus on the primary threat to the United States, which is perceived as Germany, which means against the Japanese Empire. You're going to have a strategic defensive action to ensure that you don't siphon off strength that you're going to use against Germany.
Now, what is the well? What's considered the worry in December 1941 if the United States goes on a two-ocean or two-continent offensive war in both directions at the same time? Worst case, what's the response?
I'm not sure what you're getting after that, but the worst case scenario is Britain's been knocked out of the war and it's the United States alone.
Only Britain? Well, we've got another ally.
That's right, France as well.
France has been knocked out, and now the Soviet Union.
And the Soviet Union
has not done very well in the first 6 months of their war.
In fact, when he's talking about the Soviet Union may not have entered the war at all, so it's a undivided Germany that's conquered Great Britain, France.
This is December 1941. The Soviets are on the doors of Moscow. They're on the doors of Leningrad. They've captured Kiev. They're moving in toward